This is Duke University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Duke in Washington for today's program. My name is Landy, Elliot, and I'm the Associate Director of Federal Relations and DC Operations for Duke in Washington, which is a really long way of saying that, among other things, I run the office here, Duke's office in Washington. Duke in Washington is the university's academic and outreach center here in our nation's capital, and we host alumni programs, classes, faculty and staff temporary offices, and programs like today. We're really thrilled to be hosting you here, and we welcome you to Duke in Washington. And Julie.
Hi, my name is Julie Poucher-Hartman, and on behalf of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, I'd like to welcome you all here. I'm also the editor of Islamic Commentary, which is a partnership between the Duke Islamic Studies Center, the Carolina Center for the Study of the Middle East and Muslim Civilizations, and Oxford University's Center for Islamic Studies. We're very pleased to be working on the series of elections papers with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And one of our papers, obviously today, is Professor Schanzer's paper on combating violent extremism in the U.S. And I'd like to introduce you now to the Executive Director for ISPU, Shireen Zaman, who will be moderating today's discussion, and give one more welcome also to our virtual attendees who are watching this through our Ustream channel. Everyone's welcome to tweet during this if they want. The hashtag is US Muslims, and welcome.
Thank you, Julie, and to Duke for hosting us. It's great to be here with you all. We'll probably have a few more people wandering in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So today we'll be talking about this topic in general, but we wanted to start actually first with David to talk a bit about his paper, some of the things that he's discussing, particularly, I think, the recommendations, and then we'll invite Heather and Harris to respond to that and take your questions as well. I think for those of you who are tweeting or watching online, you can also tweet your questions to the hashtag, right? So we'll take those questions as well. So I will introduce David Schanzer, who's the Associate Professor of the Practice at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University.
Well, thank you, Shireen. I have a couple of thank yous as well. ISPU has been a partner from the beginning on this, and I benefited a great deal from the content that you all provided and ideas besides publishing the brief. So many thanks, and of course to Julie and the Duke Islamic Center. Julie's been a tremendous addition to our team and the Duke office in Washington for providing the platform, and then my colleagues Heather and Harris for reading the paper and and for their coming today to talk about it, and to many friends and colleagues and maybe people I'll meet today in the audience. Many thanks. Let me just make a couple points about, for those of you who hadn't had the chance to delve into this, about what I was talking about in the policy brief. First of all, about the nature of the threat. I call it a serious but manageable threat. What do I mean by that? Listen, on average, we've had about 20 perpetrators, American Muslims, who engage in some sort of violent terrorism related activities over the past 10 years. Not really that many deaths over the course of that decade resulting from this activity, and almost all of the incidents being preempted at a fairly early stage. We've seen declines in the last 3 years. 2012, fortunately, is turning out to be a low year for these kinds of incidents. We don't count the Bangladeshi student because he was really only in the United States for a couple of months. Was not an American Muslim. 2009 was a very big spike. We didn't know at that point if that was a trend, that we were going to inexorably go upwards with the radicalization and instances of violent extremism, but at the moment that appears to be more of an aberration than a trend. And I think we've also seen the capabilities of the individuals, and that's a really important part, capabilities of these individuals who are being arrested going down. Obviously, if you look at the Hassan case, the Zazi, and the Times Square, we were worried about maybe more sophistication, more connections to international terrorist groups. But we haven't really seen that trend continuing either. Nonetheless, you just can't close your eyes to a continuing level of threat, and people who read and talk about some of my other work continually make the point about terrorism that small numbers of people can do large amounts of damage. And I think it's accurate to say, well, and think about it at least, well, what if Zazi had bombed the New York City subway? What if there had been the bombing in Times Square? Where would we be now in terms of our counterterrorism policy? What kinds of new pieces of legislation would go through Congress? What would we be talking about the level of this threat? So it's certainly something that's still serious and needs careful attention, but I think we have to keep it in a fair context given the data about the level of it. I talk about in the paper about two very general approaches that have been taken by two different cities on different coasts, NYPD and LAPD. And it's a kind of stereotype or characterization, so it's not entirely fair, but if they could be considered two different models, ways of looking at this. NYPD has been reported by the brilliant series of articles, I think, by the Associated Press, has for a number of years invested a lot of money and a lot of manpower in what I would call a very hyper-intelligence-based model in terms of putting their agents out into communities using aggressive use of informants, a lot of monitoring of public spaces and the internet, to try to suck up any sorts of pieces of data, intelligence that might be used to thwart a potential plot, to identify potential suspects for violent extremism. I'm not on the inside, so I can't do a fair evaluation, but we did have public testimony at one point by someone inside the NYPD who said that none of the there's not been a prosecution that has resulted from this aggressive model to date. Nonetheless, NYPD says that this way of policing and this way of addressing violent extremism has led to a very strong record of stopping attacks. The Los Angeles Police Department has really based their efforts much more on a community model, trying to build strong relations with the community through community policing, engagement, other types of activities, with the view that if you have strong relations with the community, ultimately the intelligence that's needed and the information that is needed will be forthcoming. And a lot of studies, some through my center and elsewhere, have shown that a lot of the incidents that have been preempted, a lot of the cases, the initial tips did result from information flowing from the community to law enforcement. And so those are the two models that are out there. What do we do going forward? And I make a number of recommendations in the report, and I'll try to go through them very quickly. Number one, I think the big problem at the moment is that there's a trust deficit nationally, I think, between the American Muslim communities and law enforcement. And I think trust is the coin of the realm here. If you don't have trust, then you're not going to have free flow of information and the other benefits that flow from a strong relationship. So I have a 5-point plan, which it seems like you need to qualify you to run for president, for dealing with this trust deficit. And they're all discussed in the paper. But first, I agree with the LAPD model, and I think that is a stronger way to go. So I think increasing, putting countering violent extremism and incorporating that into a community policing model is, and we don't have data. I can't prove it to you. So that's going to be out there. But my feeling is, having studied this, and my sense is that this is going to be the more successful way to deal with the problem. So I endorse investing in community policing at our local, state and local law enforcement level to deal with violent extremism across the country. Second, I would say I think we should stop doing what I would call blanket monitoring. What I mean by that is we should not be monitoring communities, organizations without any evidence of criminality or linkage to terrorist activity. I'm not talking about that you need to have probable cause to do monitoring or surveillance. You don't. But I think it's un-American, and I think it's extremely counterproductive to be going into mosques, to be surveilling open spaces in communities, to be monitoring organizations exclusively because they are Muslim. Whether it's legal or illegal, I think it's un-American, and I think it's totally counterproductive because when you lose the trust of the community, you're going to shut down the free flow of information and good policing, good governance. Third, I think we should have more transparent discussion and perhaps regulation about the use of informants in religious spaces. I don't think there should be any no-go zones for law enforcement. I think that is wrong, and I don't think it would be tolerated in any other circumstance. It shouldn't be tolerated in this circumstance either. Nonetheless, sending informants into holy spaces is a big act. It's an extraordinary step, and I think it should be taken with some care. Which would mean that approvals for these types of activities ought to be at very high levels of law enforcement, whether it be the FBI or state and local law enforcement. And I think there has to be a lot of education and discussion with the community about when this is done, why it is done, the precautions that are taken, to ensure that information about innocent people is not collected and maintained. There's a lot that can be done in terms of discussion and about this with the community that I think would help deflate the tension that comes around it without saying, well, this is a practice that can never be done, because I think that would be a mistake as well. Fourth, I think that law enforcement in conjunction with social services, educational institutions, we need to find some sort of alternative path other than prosecution and incarceration for dealing with people who are moving down a pathway of radicalization. Having radical ideas, of course, is not a crime in the United States, but engaging in any types of activities like material support or financial contributions to terrorism is. There's definitely an area when somebody's heading down the wrong path before they engage in criminality in which individuals, can be taken off of that pathway. We've certainly seen it with respect to dealing with gangs and youth crime, and there's no reason we can't have that kind of model with respect to violent extremism. And I think if you expect parents to provide information about their children, or imams or community members about individuals they're concerned about, if the only tool in your toolkit is a 15-year sentence for material support for terrorism, you are not going to have a great deal of cooperation, or you're certainly not going to maximize. You're only going to get information in absolute emergency circumstances, i.e. the parents who are concerned about their children who had already left for Pakistan. That's way too late in the game as far as I'm concerned. And my fifth point in dealing with the trust deficit, and I'm going to make one more point after that and turn it over to everybody else, is, I think it's really important to promote the contributions that American Muslims are making to our civic life in a very public way. And I really encourage our political community leaders to be visible in the Muslim community and be visible to the other parts of their community, being in the Muslim community, pictures in local newspapers, showing up at holidays, like you do with other civic organizations, the 4-H club, other religious groups, churches, whatnot. I think that's a really important way to break down some of the barriers that have arisen over the past 10 years, demonstrate to Muslims that everybody wants them to be part of our American cultural and civic life, and show support from officials. And that really, we need that to be a very bipartisan type of effort. I don't think it's healthy for any community to be the constituents of only one part of our political life. On the other side, I want to make just one more quick point, is that countering violent extremism and these kinds of efforts can't really be a one-way street. It can't only be about Muslim complaints about law enforcement. Law enforcement taking steps to build trust with the Muslim community. Muslim community needs to do things to build trust with law enforcement. And that means sometimes, I think, having law enforcement's back. I think too often the only image that people see on television when there's a prosecution announced or arrest is law enforcement saying one thing and then representatives of the Muslim community saying, well, this was a setup, or this was an illegitimate investigation. And this is at the arrest stage, not at trial, even after all the evidence has been completed. Now, I'm not saying that anybody should accuse anyone of being guilty before they've had a chance to go through the process. But I do mean to say that I think building trust and is necessary for Muslims to not only be critical of law enforcement, but to help explain law enforcement's activities when they're legitimate and when they are proper procedures are being followed and when there's good communication to their constituencies and to the public. So we can show that this is a partnership for dealing with this problem and not a one-way street. And I think with that, I'll close, and I really look forward to my comments from my esteemed colleagues.
Thank you, David. Maybe we'll go first to Heather. So Heather Hurlburt is the Executive Director of the National Security Network here in Washington, D.C. So we'll hear from you and then.
Thanks. David, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I'm going to talk about it mostly in the political context, in as much as since we're now, I think everyone can say with great relief, in the last 2 weeks of this election cycle. And on the one hand, David, you've laid out a spectrum of choices for domestic counterterrorism policy, and you put both presidential candidates somewhere in the middle of it, noting that both the limited things that Governor Romney has said, policies he supported during his time as governor, specifically his very, very strong enthusiasm for the Fusion Center, the DHS Fusion Center model, as well as choices that President Obama has made during his first term, place them both somewhere in the middle, that they're neither New York nor LA. But of course, Shireen, as you said at the beginning, nowhere in this election have words like hyperintelligence or community policing model been used. And so in that sense, this debate, this election campaign has not been about these issues at all. But it's a mistake to conclude from that nothing that's been happening or that happens in the next 2 weeks is relevant. And I want to suggest 3 factors that are going to be greatly influential on the choices that the policy community and the advocacy community have around the issues, David, that you've laid out. And the first one is really to come back to this first thing you said, and that is the threat perception. And, 2 really fascinating trends about this election. One being that the sort of level of American interest in terrorism, perception of terrorism as a top issue, perception of it as a voting issue has really just fallen off the table. Continuing a downward trend, I think the height would have been in 2002, and a pretty steady downward trend since then. Now, on the other hand, it takes very little for that to spike back up again. Interestingly, as we saw right after bin Laden was assassinated, the percentage of Americans who thought it was strongly likely that there'd be a terrorist attack soon went from 4% to 26%. So, gone but not forgotten is how I would frame it. And that has led to, there was an abortive effort earlier this month by one presidential campaign to push out the idea that the threat of terrorism that we face, quote, has grown so much worse, unquote, as Governor Romney said in his speech at BMI. And he and his surrogates pursued that line of attack pretty aggressively for about a week, which was interesting because, of course, if you believe that the threat has grown, if you go back to that 2009 domestic spike that you referred to, if you look at the killing of an American ambassador and 3 others in Benghazi, and you believe that that's something that's happening every day, every week, every month, or could happen every day, every week, every month, then you listen to the kind of arguments David was just making rather differently, then if you look at the domestic trends that he talked about, the international trend in which the National Counterterrorism Center says that the total number of worldwide terrorist attacks in 2011 fell 12% from 2010 and 29% from 2007. So that on net, actually, on a sort of strictly factual basis, the threat that the world faces from terrorism is substantially less than it was 4 years ago. And just as a reminder of the 13,288 people killed worldwide by terrorist attacks last year, 17 were private U.S. citizens, which is 0.001%. So again, it's a tragedy for every person who's killed. It's a problem, but it is just not a massive, massive daily threat to the continuity of our society and our way of life. So which viewpoint wins out in this campaign and which viewpoint is seen to win out in this campaign is going to be very relevant foundation for the kind of discussion you're having. And I would just note that Newt Gingrich released a video ad this morning, which seems to suggest that world chaos is imminent, that our security is under massive, massive threat. And the only source of global chaos referenced in this video is demonstrations in Cairo. So we continue to struggle on these issues with the connection, whether explicit or implicit, between events in the Muslim world, perceptions of American Muslims, and fears about security that Americans have. And that, I think, is going to continue to be a limiting factor that frames policymaking. To say a little more on that, obviously there's been really bad news on the tone of public debate in the forms of the McCarthyite attacks on Huma Abedin earlier this year. And Harris, you will probably have a lot more to say about that. From my perspective, the good news is that there was political pushback on this, and that it has become, instead of just being something that happens in the political arena, it's actually a source of debate in the political arena, so that you can both see a certain segment of American politics resorting to it and another segment of American politics trying to derive political benefit from not giving into it. And that is essential in the long run if we're going to get to this place, David, that you describe, in which American Muslims, again, have a place in both political parties and are a block of fairly affluent voters that are being courted by both parties, which, if you think about how other groups have integrated into American life, is what you want in terms of social cohesion. And we're not there in this election campaign, but I think it's possible to look at that, hopefully. The last point I want to make is that, as you say in the paper, we are in an era of constrained resources and we're not coming out of it anytime soon. And what's fascinating is we're talking about this a lot on the campaign trail in the context of the Pentagon budget. We're not talking about it at all in the context of the DHS budget. I haven't heard anyone make the point that falling off the fiscal cliff will horribly expose us to unchecked domestic radicalization, for example. And that, to me, is a very interesting thing, and it suggests, there was a piece by Scott Shane in the New York Times yesterday asking the question of whether what he called a blank check for Homeland Security had come to an end. And it's clear that that's the case. Pentagon spending doubled in the decade after 9/11, and it's clear that that curve of increase has come to an end. And the question of whether we're going to hit something similar on Homeland Security. And then I think, David, that cuts two ways for your points, because to the extent that proposals are perceived to be effective as well as cost efficient, it's great. But of course, community policing is not cheap. And as anybody who's ever tried to do any community work knows, it takes a lot of time that you have to pay for to go out and talk to people. And it may be that the approaches you're promoting don't actually look cost effective. And so that will be a whole other interesting line of debate that I think we're going to see after this election. And with that, back to you.
So thank you, Heather. I have a couple follow-up questions for you, but I'll let Harris go first. So Harris is the Washington, D.C. Office Director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council.
Thank you. Thank you, Shireen, for the conversation. And thank you, David, for your thoughts. And, it was interesting kind of reading through the paper and the recommendations. What kind of hit me was that these recommendations are coming. We're still talking about these recommendations 10 years after 9/11. And I think that's that's a testament to where we are when it comes to the idea of community policing, when it comes to the idea of community engagement and ensuring that the American Muslim community is part of the process and part of the solution. And I think that that tells us that we still have some work to do. We do still have, although as you've said in the paper, as you said in your remarks, and has been proven by studies that have come out of your center and studies that have come out of other institutions, that when communities have been part of the conversation, have been part of the process, you have seen times where a lot of these attempted plots have been unfoiled in the process. That includes parents, that includes family members, it includes community members, imams, and so many other folks. So it's telling that we're still having this conversation. And I think we need to continue to have the conversation, but we are 10, 11 years, and I just wanted to make that point initially. But I think one thing that really stood out in your paper was your reference as trust being the key commodity here. And I think from a more community perspective, having this conversation from a community perspective, I see this in kind of two different frames. Number one, the federal frame, the federal law enforcement agencies frame. So I think that there's a huge deficit of trust when it comes to federal law enforcement agencies and the American Muslim community. I think since 9/11, the trust between Muslim communities and the FBI, that deficit is very wide. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Even the perceptions of DHS, the NCTC, all of the federal law enforcement agencies that have tried in one way or another to engage, to impact, and have conversations with local communities, there is a large deficit of trust. And I think that's where, and I'm not sure if we need to restart the conversation at the federal level. What I think we probably need to do, and I think there's a less of a deficit, and I think a lot of times there is distrust with local law enforcement agencies, because some of the things that they have done have worked over the past decade. And other than one specific city, which is New York, Los Angeles, as you mentioned, Detroit, Portland, Chicago, Houston, even Dallas, a lot of the major cities who've had the funding, as you mentioned. I mean, some of the more smaller cities just don't have the funding to be able to have even one person focus on community engagement. But the cities that have had the resources, they have instituted programs at the local level to engage. And it has worked. It's worked, as you mentioned. And so I think that's where we need to start to focus on. And a lot of the conversations that we have with, whether it's the FBI, with DHS, with NCTC, is we say, you know what, if you're going to go into communities and you want to institute programs in local communities, the best way to institute programs is through partnership with local law enforcement agencies. Because they see folks on a regular basis. They attend the Eid events at the mosque. They attend the Ramadan events. They're able to engage. And there's this less, the perception is a huge issue. I mean, perception with the FBI. I was just in Los Angeles. I met with folks at the FBI last week, and then I was in Orange County earlier this week, and having conversations. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the situations in Irvine, and I was having conversation with some very smart, very intelligent community leaders and folks, and those perceptions are still very real, that the FBI is blanketly surveilling Muslim communities. You go into local mosques, people still have the perception that there's an informant somewhere, and that we've got to pay attention to anyone new who walks into the community. And I think that chilling effect has a huge impact on the trust deficit, and also on the fact that American Muslims, when you have that chilling effect, that perception, and then you see the political conversations that take place from folks like Michelle Bachmann, from folks like Newt Gingrich. People are not able to decipher between the intricacies of various federal agencies. We in Washington are able to, decipher the acronyms. At the local level, people are not able to decipher the acronyms. And so when they see Michelle Bachmann, Newt Gingrich, FBI, NCTC, they're not able to decipher the nuances. And I think what we have to do is to invest in local community partnerships, in local community policing efforts, so that we start to rebuild that trust at the local level. And then, because what I'm afraid of is that we might get into a post-trust era, and that's something that I do not want to see, because you're getting into a post-trust era. I think a lot of people right now are very dismissive at the federal law enforcement agency side and at the local community side. They say, you know what, these programs are not working. I mean, I've heard folks at the federal level say, it's not worth investing in. We're not getting any information out of it. We're not going to be, getting any cooperation. So why even make that investment? And then you hear folks at the community level saying, well, no matter what we do, if we host the FBI, and this is the comment that I got from one community leader in Southern California, said, when we host the FBI at a public forum to come and engage our communities, they're still going to be coming through the back door anyways. So why should I go through the effort of hosting them at a public forum, exposing my community to that, and then knowing that they're going to come through the back door? And so I really hope that we don't reach that stage of a post-trust era. I think starting at the local level, investing in local programs, and even when the federal agencies want to engage, doing that through local law enforcement, I think we can get back to building that trust again, and hopefully, no matter who's the president in the next 4 years, continue to build, as you said in your paper, build on the successes that we've had in the past 4 years.
Thank you. So, Harris, I'll start with you since you are fresh in everybody's minds. So one of the things that we talked about just before we sat down to the panel was building, sort of picking up on this trust piece. So how, especially in the Muslim community, MPAC has often played that role between sort of bringing the conversations together between law enforcement and the Muslim community, and you have a lot of skeptics in the Muslim community. So how do you keep that line, if the goal is to continue to build trust and engagement, how do you keep those lines of communication open?
It's difficult. It's difficult, and as you even highlight in your paper, David, there was the instance with the SARS program in Los Angeles.
Tell people the acronym.
Suspicious activity reporting.
We have people outside of DC.
All right, sorry, that's right. It's a suspicious activity reporting program that the Los Angeles Police Department had instituted, and there was a lot of questions as to whether there was reports that were coming in that were just not credible, and people's conversations and people's behaviors and people's even thought processes to a certain extent were being reported, and it was going into a system that was being collected. So there was a lot of hesitation from the community part, and what the LAPD tried to do was say, you know what, we want to work with local communities. So if you have concern, let's go through the process of reform. If you've got concerns, let's go through the process of reform. Let's sit at the table. Let's engage, and let's have a conversation. And there were, as you mentioned, there were various factors and various tendencies within this conversation. There were folks at the local level who were saying, no, we're not going to even engage the LAPD on this. This program completely needs to be thrown out the door, and we're not going to have this conversation. You continue to surveil our community blanketly, which I don't agree. I don't think that's the approach that LAPD has taken. I think that's definitely something that's happened in New York, but the LAPD is far from that at this point. And so you had folks who were saying, we are not going to allow this to happen. And then you had other people, other coalition partners who joined them. Some of the immigrant, immigration reform groups who also joined that conversation. And then you had some of the folks like us and others who said, you know what, this is not going. This is a reality. This is a reality. Surveillance, to a certain extent, is a reality. How do we now engage in the conversation to try to bring about reforms? And I think that's very difficult to have in a community that doesn't have, number one, the resources and the nuanced understanding of a lot of these issues to have these conversations at the local level. There's no MPAC, even CARE, and some of the other Muslim American advocacy groups don't have a lot of resources on the ground. So if you go to a city like Portland, you don't have a national advocacy or even a local advocacy group that's engaging in these conversations. The resources are just not there. If you go to cities like even Minneapolis, if you go to places especially in the South and the Midwest, that same type of institutional infrastructure does not exist for local communities to engage in these conversations. So then the community feels skeptical about engaging. But I think we have to continue to push that. And I think at the national level, at the local level, as you say, I think Muslim leaders do burden a responsibility that when there are programs that work, that are not invasive, that are not problematic at the civil liberties level, they need to be able to come out publicly and state that this is something that we are working with law enforcement agencies with, and we need to come to a solution, and we need to come to understanding to, if we have concerns, put out reforms. And I think there are people who've done that, and Mike, he's in the audience, and we've worked at the national level with various folks to do this. And I think when Muslim leaders are willing to take that step, then you do also see a level of acceptance from the law enforcement community to sit at the table and talk more about reforms. And I think if we do continue to build on that, and the skeptics are going to be out there, they're going to continue to exist. If we go beyond the skeptics, have those hard conversations, bring in a lot of the imams who are being impacted by these conversations at the local level. I mean, I had imams coming to me say, you know what, I want to talk to law enforcement agencies. I want to have conversations with law enforcement agencies. I don't know how to. I don't have the training. I don't have the skills. I don't have the understanding. I know that there are sometimes problematic individuals in my community. I push back against them in my sermons, in my private conversations, and I would like to speak to law enforcement agencies, but I don't have the platform. And that goes to your point about creating mechanisms other than law enforcement, other than criminality, to say, okay, here's a program that maybe a few psychologists, sociologists, law enforcement agencies, imams, community leaders have put together, maybe sponsored by a local university, that can bring in problem individuals, that can put them through a program so that there's this transparency, so that we don't have to worry about that. Every time there's an issue that comes up, it's 30 to life. And I think that's the huge skepticism from our community that kind of goes out there when we have this conversation. But we need to keep pushing forward. I think that's the key. Forward, yes.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Heather, so the optimist in me took the lack of conversation or lack of highlighting, I guess, about the national security questions in this campaign as an indication that maybe because it had sort of dropped in priority for the American people, that might actually give whoever comes into office sort of political cover for addressing some of the more controversial and problematic policies that we have at a federal level. But it sounds like sort of what you're saying is that what's not being said explicitly is what we should actually be more worried about. So I'm interested if you think there may be, because particularly the American public, I mean, we know there's partisan interest in this as well, but particularly the public doesn't see this as sort of the biggest issue anymore. Could that allow politicians and policymakers to be a bit more creative?
Well, I can give you an optimistic or a pessimistic
Give us
take
both.
on that. So the optimistic take on it is, number one, it's not a top of mind issue anymore.
Right.
And number two, you no longer have the case, as you did in 2002, 2004, where one party has a monopoly on being perceived as tough. So ideally, after this election, you reach a case where both parties can come at it from a fiscal constraint perspective, from an effectiveness perspective, from we want to compete for Muslim votes in the future perspective. So that, and some evidence to support that actually. It was very interesting to watch the rise and then fall of the politicization of the events around Benghazi. Mm-hmm. And I think many people were surprised, including people on the Obama campaign, that Romney did not lead in this last debate, that he was given the opportunity to really go after Obama again on Benghazi and did not do so. And if you ask yourself, why did he not do that? Why did he not have that index card? The assumption is because it wasn't polling well. And that is enormously good news for anyone who wants to pursue policies which require less neuralgia about Islam, about political Islam, and about terrorism that grows out of Islam. So that's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that 4 to 26% that I talked about. That it turns out that the society really was changed in a fundamental way by 9/11, and we're never going to snap back to where we were. And the public opinion work that you do, you see that there was a lasting change, a heightened level of anxiety that unfortunately, when twinned with economic anxiety, which it also looks like isn't going away anytime soon, we're going to continue to have an anxious public and a segment of the public that responds well to this kind of demagoguery. And frankly, until it gets to be the case that, we really miss the ties that the American Muslim community had in the past with the Republican Party, frankly. And until we can get back to the point that there's a competition, then there's going to be the temptation, number one, to abuse these issues politically. And number two, just any bureaucrat sitting anywhere knows that if something happens that can be traced to his or her negligence or lack of severity, there's a very, very severe cost for that. And so therefore, the temptation is always going to be to err on the side of, well, at least nobody could say I didn't do enough. And so that's sort of a human dynamic, and that's going to take a lot longer to go away.
David, before we open it up to the audience, do you have kind of...
I'll be just a couple comments. Thank you for the excellent commentary. I think Harris is right about the federal-local divide. I mean, first thing is that federal officials are linked with immigration, and in any immigrant community, that makes it hard right off the bat. Where local authorities don't have that responsibility, and therefore can I think start off the relationship on a better footing. Second of all, in terms of the Bureau, the problem with this issue is that you can do a lot to try to build up trust, and one episode or small numbers of episodes can damage a lot of groundwork. So you look at some of the materials that slipped into FBI training, very damaging in the community. I think the FBI dealt with it very effectively, but the effects from that linger. FBI is a big organization, so you could have very well-intentioned people in headquarters who are saying all the right things, but somebody runs a bad informant in LA. The Montilla case is still being talked about. I heard a lengthy piece on NPR not long ago about that case, and the damage that does to trust over the long run can have very long-term effects that it's hard to get back. So, I think the Bureau, the people I talk to who work on this issue, to me, understand the issue, understand the right way to go about things. I think there was a lot of pressure in the early years to make cases, to show results. I think a lot of that has dissipated, and we're in a much more mature phase of dealing with this problem. So hopefully the federal agencies can work on it, but I ultimately agree that if we're going to have really productive, it's better to focus on what the local police are doing. Heather, I don't know what to say about the question on restrained resources. I think one of the reasons I like to put this in a community policing model is because that's what local law enforcement, at least in many places, is doing. So the question is, can we add this particular community? Can we add can we integrate this particular issue into activities that are part of the culture of policing in many, many major cities already? And so, yes, while it might be one or two people who are dedicated much that it's not a huge resource constraint. I think you talked about the politics of this well, and I don't think I'm going to wander into that unless there are other questions. So why don't we open it up to everybody else?
Sure. I mean, the people here are actually also experts, many of you in your own right working on these issues. So, we can definitely open it up to a discussion. We have a relatively small number of people, so you can just sort of raise your hand and identify yourself, and we'll go from there. We'll also, if there's any questions coming in online, we'll take those as well. Please.
Hi, I'm Rick Legault. Hi, David. So if you ask 5 different large city police chiefs what community policing means, you're likely to get 7 different answers. So instead of saying community policing is a good idea, are there any particular tenets in this are there any particular tenets of particular community policing programs, particular communities that you think best represent the right path?
Well, odd that you would ask this question, Rick, because you know that we're going to be embarking on a study looking at just that issue. With many thanks to the Department of Justice for funding that. So I guess my answer is let's talk about it a year from now. I mean, I think there's despite my, a couple of things that I said in the paper about what we know communities are doing. There've been a couple other case studies, some of the places that Harris mentioned, but I think nationally we have very little picture what's being done. And I also think, it's important to talk about violent extremism, not just among American Muslims, but among other groups or people who are motivated by other ideologies. And there's certainly no reason that these techniques couldn't be applied to those problems as well. So our study will be designed to try to figure out actually what it is that police departments are doing. How do they perceive the problem? What do they see as the potential strategies that are productive? What are barriers to cooperation that they perceive? And then, maybe when we have some data from this, we'll be able to have a little bit more informed conversation about what we think will work and what doesn't. So I guess it's a stay tuned answer, which isn't very satisfying. Maybe some of my colleagues have more insight can help.
One thing I would say, one tenet of the model is to, number one, desecuritizing the relationship. I think at the local level, and local police departments are able to do that. I think for too long the relationship has been based on, well, do you have tips? Here I come for the tips, and if you've got, it's a very securitized relationship, and I think moving beyond that to holistically approaching the issue, looking at the demographics locally. The American Muslim community is not monolithic by any means. I mean, you've got a very strong indigenous community. You've got, within the immigrant community, you've got multiple trends and strains. So there's so many different folks. So it has to be very localized, and it has to be desecuritized. So the issues that impact American Muslims are issues like mortgage fraud. To talk about that. To talk about, gang violence in certain communities, and that's part of what impacts American Muslim communities. To talk about cybersecurity and safety for young people, that has to be part of the conversation as well. So desecuritizing the relationship is extremely important. And the second tenet is making it very localized. That one national model does not necessarily work for another. One national city does not necessarily work for another city. So those two components, I think, are important.
Sure.
Hi. Mike Wallace, and now with Bruce Allen, having spent 31 years in the FBI and a great deal of the last decade working on these issues. So I consider myself someone with a vested interest, much like the community has. I can go in a lot of different directions, but I guess the one point that I want to make without monopolizing is how strongly I disagree with the language used about targeting the community because of the division. If anybody's heard me speak publicly in the mosques or 31 years, I never asked anyone in any investigation what the religion was. And the thought that, and I think this is counterproductive to the conversation, when page 6 and blanket surveillance programs. I'm not sure what a blanket surveillance program is. Just do the math on the number of, speak from my experience, FBI agents compared to the number of Arab American Muslim population. There's probably an FBI agent for every several thousand Muslims, so I'm not sure how one person blankets 100 or 1,000. Mathematically, you can't get that. And what David, you mentioned in your commentary, targeted these communities exclusively was the word you used for the religion. I don't know how much more forcefully I could say that I don't believe that's the truth. I just don't. Anecdotally, is it out there with some departments somewhere? Perhaps. I just have to tell you, as someone who earned your tax dollars for 3 decades,
phase. That does not happen. And I was one of the founders of the FBI, or American Muslim Outreach Committee, Advisory Committee across the field office, which, Paris, I hope you still attend every month. So it's 12 years later, it's still going on. And I couldn't agree more that it is all about trust. I find it a little bit interesting that you seem to think there's this big deficit of trust that bothers me, because I couldn't agree more that you need that. But I'm not sure how you balance that pessimistic view with the number of cases that are out there where the community has, in fact, as I think one or both of you mentioned, come forward. So something's working right. And I think that's what we need to focus on when you're looking for the positive and the model and the best practices and the lessons learned, is where is it right and how do we replicate that? And I'll close with a thought. Heather, and I believe it was this morning's article on the front page of the New York Times, talked about those statistics. And even though in the last 10 years, 160,000 homicides have taken place, I think the number for all titles is 14. And I've been mesmerized over the years of how it is, having grown up in a police officer's house, that tens of thousands of American citizens died in violent crime acts in 2001, and tens of thousands died on the highway. Yet you just had a commission on highway safety or more money going into police departments for violent crime. So it is something we're dealing with. I'm not sure, given the budget restrictions, how we address this. And I'll close with this, because I think therein lies the challenge. The White House has come out with a strategy a year ago asking for the community to take on countering violent extremism without an extra nickel, without an extra buck. There's the challenge.
Can I just jump in on that, because I feel like it's the framing to the more specific questions. And because, politically, people have been trying since maybe 2002 or 2003, and people have been tempted to make the highway safety argument, or the lightning argument, or the drowning in the bathtub argument, all of which are statistically true. But we as Americans, we have at some point made whatever accommodation we're going to make in our mind that, man, it is really cool to be able to drive 80 miles an hour, and that I intellectually somewhere in my mind have taken on the idea that that might have a bad result for me. We have never, as a society, taken on the idea that terrorism is a risk that we run. That we've never, and you can say this is a good thing or a bad thing, a true thing or a false thing, but it just is the way the collective mind works. We've never accepted that terrorism is like lightning, that to a certain extent it just happens. And I think, and David, I was thinking this earlier, maybe your colleagues, that just in any society there is going to be a small percentage of highly, highly disaffected people who are drawn to extreme ideologies to justify violence. And they will find an extreme ideology available to them. But we have never, as a society, and we don't have a political movement that thinks this is a good way to go, to say, okay, terrorism is another thing like lightning and car crashes. So as long as that's the case, your flexibility in how you talk about terrorism is going to be quite limited. And I also think, and the reason I jumped in front of you two guys, is that I actually think that has a lot to do with the words you choose and the way you perceive what happens. And it's the reason that you can say with great sincerity, nobody was targeted because of their religion. And Harris will say back to you with great sincerity, what do you mean? Of course people were targeted because of their religion. And we've been having that argument pretty much nonstop. But the reason that we keep having it is because either terrorism is something that's totally outside the realm of the normal, the criminal, which also, by the way, makes it ridiculous to talk about community policing as the solution if you really believe that terrorism isn't the same as crime. And as long as the culture is that way, and as I say, I think it's gradually getting better, but we're not anywhere near that, then this conversation we can keep edging towards each other, but the only thing we can do is have this debate in a civil way.
Let me address Mike's point. Listen, I have no evidence of any federal official targeting people based on religion, but I'm sorry, I just don't think you can read the 24 articles from the Associated Press on the NYPD program and not come to that conclusion. The article from yesterday about now, unless it's all fabricated, I mean, we know that not everything in the media is true, but this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning series, and we're losing our power. Somebody doesn't want this point to come out, really. But the article from yesterday was incredibly powerful about a recruit of somebody who would, I guess, had some drug offenses and was on his way to jail, and was recruited, a Muslim young man, and unless he's telling a total fabrication, they just told him, go out, take pictures of your friends, tell us what is happening in the mosque, spy on the Muslim Students Association. To me, that's religious targeting. I mean, we can call it what we want, but it wasn't, here's a tip about we think that this individual might be engaged in criminal activity, or we've observed in this neighborhood some suspicious things. Go there because there was evidence, or even, I'm not saying up to probable cause, but, suspicion of some activities that were wrong. Go there. That's not what he was told to do. So that's what I was talking about on page 6. You're right. We don't have the law enforcement to blanket a community, but this article talks about just going to communities because they were Muslim, not because there was suspicion of illegal activity there. And that's what I think is very damaging to the trust deficit. And I'll say just one other point on that is that what's happening in New York, is happening in New York, but it's going to affect the relations with Muslims all over the country because it is front page, it is New York, and it's a big deal.
I think just one quick point, and I should point out here, David and I have been having this conversation for years, and I'm glad to be at Duke in Washington because he hosted me at Duke a couple of weeks ago. But I'm awfully cautious about using anecdotes to make policy or to make blanket statements, just as I say I'm adamantly opposed to the whole religion argument because you can't paint 1.2 or however many billion the number is with a brush because a particular individual was of a particular religious persuasion. I just don't think that's credible. Similarly, although it is NYPD, the largest police department in the world, I think it's an army, it's one police department out of 16,000, 20,000, however many police departments we have in this country. So I would say we need to be cautious about saying because NYPD did it, and there's debates back and forth about the validity, and I think I come down much more closely on your side. I don't think we can paint all of law enforcement across this country with believing that works, or saying that works, or having done whatever it is that they did.
Well, we're in violent agreement then. I'll look at what I wrote again, and it was certainly not my intention to say this is happening everywhere and has to end. I think it should not happen anywhere, and that is my policy recommendation.
And I think to that point, we've never made the argument, or have never in speech or in writing have said that there's blanket religious surveillance of American Muslim communities. But and I agree with the argument that anecdotes, you can't use anecdotes. But then when the number of anecdotes kind of supersede a certain amount, you'd say, okay, now we need to think about if there's a culture that exists within pockets of certain departments. I'm not saying the whole department, but if there's a culture as a result of the politicization of this this conversation that we're having, because that has existed over the past decade, as a result of the trainings that have happened, both at the federal level, state level, and local level, is there a culture within certain pockets of certain departments that allows for this type of behavior to take place? So if we're going to say it's not policy, okay, it may not be policy on paper, it may not even be, it may not be official policy, but is there a culture that has allowed for this to take place? Because it's happened in LA, it's happened in Orange County, it's happened in San Francisco, it's happened in Dallas, it's happened in New York, it's happened in Florida, it's happened in Chicago, it's happened the list goes on, and there may be 1 or 2 incidents in each city, but then at some point we have to be able to say, what is it that's allowing it to happen at that level? And how can we address it? Because even if it's not official policy, even if it's not something that's pervasive at a very large level, it drives perceptions. And unfortunately, in kind of the business that we deal with, perceptions are realities a lot of time. And how do we break through those perceptions so that we can build that trust and say that we can get to a point where we won't have to worry about those issues. So I think we need to reassess that culture, right? Because that culture does, when I get a call from a police department in the Midwest, small police department that says, we are getting calls from citizens asking us to do training on how to counter Sharia law and conversation on terrorism. When the local police department is just trying to put together like anti-mortgage fraud workshops for them because that's what impacts them the most, then we have to have a conversation as to why that's occurring. And I think that's part of why we need to continue to have these conversations and why the research needs to continue.
I don't disagree, and if we can have those conversations with that level of specificity versus the sweeping condemnations that go out, then I think that'll be a helpful thing.
Read.
There was a question in the back.
So,
Oh, sorry, behind you. And then you can go.
Jerry Blow, Professional Research Service. I have three questions. I hope to make them really short. The first might be more of a comment. In the paper, you discussed the New York and LA models in terms of CVE. Is it possible that in your description of the New York model, you included a lot of what we've commonly seen as counterterrorism work, as well as CVE? That kind of maybe potentially makes the New York model look far more aggressive, assertive, rather than as opposed to the LA model, which has New York might not have the same kind of things that the LA does on the ground, but certainly the way it's described is throwing in a bunch of counterterrorism things. And that's a big second point is that you made a comment about New York's intelligence program not giving a single beat. And I think that statement comes from, or is about or references the demographics groups, a very specific program that NYPD is running, not the entire NYPD intelligence program, because I suspect they would disagree with you that their intelligence program has led to a lot of things, a lot of investigations at large, but I'm not sure about that either. And then finally, a comment about community policing. How effective will it be to increase our efforts in community policing if terrorism is largely prosecuted and investigated by federal agencies, while community policing is something that happens? I'm sorry to bombard you.
I think we can, the last question first is that's why we have the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and that's why there's a good integration of local policing with federal authorities, and we've seen a lot of cooperation where leads that are developed are ultimately moved up through the Joint Terrorism Task Force. They're usually handled by the FBI. If the FBI doesn't want to do it, then local authorities do, and so I don't see a problem with that. If the information pipeline is working, and Lord knows we've invested in a gazillion different ways to try to make that happen. So if that's not working yet, I'm not sure it ever is going to. On the question of the blurring between counterterrorism and CVE, I just reject that you can have two programs trying to get to the same result. I think the goal is to stop people from radicalizing and ultimately engaging in violence. And if you have one set of things that you're going to call counterterrorism, that we're making the other set of things that you're doing, countering violent extremism, impossible, if not extremely difficult, because what you're doing on the counterterrorism side is damaging any trust that you could do to. So I dismiss that as a dichotomy, and I think you have to have a consolidated approach, that comprehensive approach that makes sense and whose pieces hang together. And I've forgotten your second question.
The last one was about the intelligence leads.
Yeah.
I answered that one. It was the second question. I didn't really.
It was about leads and just clarifying if NYPD.
I can't say with certainty. I don't remember who the quote was from. I think it was about, you're right, the intelligence unit, and that's the unit that is reportedly been responsible for the types of surveillance things that I just had this heated discussion with my friend Mike about, and that I think is a is a counterproductive model. And this was quoted in media sources from testimony that somebody in some sort of civil lawsuit that a NYPD official was giving. So I'm just basing it on that. I don't suggest that the entire NYPD has never come up with a lead to stop a terrorism case. I'm sure that's almost certainly not true.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to draw a finer distinction there. That there is a bigger intelligence program that actually has led to some substantive leads. But I imagine New York would argue that. But within that intelligence program, there's a demographics unit that I think.
I would have to go back to the quote and go back to who the official was before I could, make that.
And one point about the CT versus the CVE, the counterviolence. I think we have to be very careful in terms of separating these two, because there's a constitutionality issue here. If you're going to separate CT from CVE, then what is CVE? Then what do you focus on when it comes to CVE? Are you focusing on thoughts? Are we focusing on ideology? Are we focusing on extremist thought only? And I think that's where a lot of worry from civil liberties groups and community groups and even local communities who are saying that law enforcement agencies and government should not be dabbling into this area of thought. This is our area. We will deal with this issue. Let us have this conversation. If we think that there's a problematic trend like any other community, we will deal with that. So making that distinction between CVE and CT and having separate programming, I think can lead to very problematic. I think that's more of a European approach, and which in my opinion has not worked, and has led to more problems with local communities and marginalization of communities in places like Britain. So I would suggest that we be extremely careful if we talk about separating CVE versus CT.
I had a quick question. I've noticed that it seems that the executive branch at the highest levels has been very supportive of the local role in CVE. So you have the president having a strategy about empowering local partners, and you have Secretary of Homeland Security saying, Homeland Security is hometown security, that kind of thing. But meanwhile, Congress has really cut the grant funding for local departments to do these kind of projects that might allow them to sort of do the things that the presidential strategy is talking about. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about why there's sort of this disconnect there.
Well, this is a part of the paper I didn't really talk about, and I talk about a little bit towards the end, which is, there's definitely, I think the strategy was an aspirational document that came with no staffing or resources attached to it. And I think the agencies who are tasked with implementing it have a pretty big challenge. So the question is, are these things that the president has told the agencies to do, are they going to go unimplemented? I think they're all kind of, you get an order from the White House, you're going to figure out a way to do it, but they're going to have to come up with their own resource to do it, which means other programs are being pulled from, or they're just not going to really be able to do it effectively. So, one of my recommendations is that, if this is a program that's really that important, then, it needs to be built into the budget, because then otherwise it's just words on paper.
Horace, you mentioned something about this actually earlier that's really important in this context, which is that DHS, since its founding, Congress has struggled and fought over do we assign resources equally across the country, or do we target certain localities? And so it's not an accident that it's easier to get funding for community policing in big cities than small cities. That's true if you're talking about chemical plant security. Exactly. That's true a whole range of DHS issues. So that you can trace back to the founding fathers' struggle with the House and the Senate. So that's not a new problem in American politics. The other point that I think goes to your question is those kinds of programs that have to do with people talking to each other, that you could imagine the congressional hearing where someone stands up and says, and they took DHS money and they used it to have seminars on mortgage fraud. Right. And you could imagine the righteous outrage about why the heck are we spending your security dollars on mortgage fraud, even though these gentlemen and could explain to you why that's a really good strategy. So programs that don't have an immediate, obvious, clear political, and ex people were put in jail as a result, are always going to be more politically vulnerable. And the question, it all comes back to politics of how you can create some kind of bipartisan interest in programs that actually work, as opposed to programs that sound like they work, or I'm sorry to say, that you've seen on 24.
Yeah, and I see. I mean, the national strategy, from what I've kind of gathered, was an orientation document. To be honest, I mean, that's what and I think it was a good document. We issued a long statement and supporting a lot of it and critiquing some of it, but in the way it's been implemented, and the way it's been kind of sent out to various agencies, I think a lot of it was an orientation document. This is how we're going to have to orient a lot of the existing programs. I didn't see too many new programs coming out of it, but even it was to orient the existing programs that were taking place at DHS, at DOJ, at FBI, at various agencies.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I'm Imam Ben Abdul Haq. Own Secure Transportation International. I provide security. So some of us are involved. Just keep a low profile on the radar. But,
That's the best way to do it.
Exactly. So we are involved in a lot of things. I wanted to commend Mike on, and I know Dr. Shaver too, but I wanted to commend Mike on what he was saying about the language. One of the things, may sound idealistic, but it takes time to do some of the things. As an African American Muslim, one of the things we had to do was to get the media and others to stop using the term black Muslim. We were offended by it. So you don't hear that term anymore. So now let's bring it up to the 21st century and what Mike is saying. One of the things we have to do is create a new lexicon for these words. When a Western person hears the word jihadist, they think of a terrorist, correct? But to those in the Middle East, you say jihadist, it's a badge of honor. Yeah, I'm a jihadist. So we should try to avoid using words that's going to fuel the fire. Another terminology, just one example, is when we say religious extremists. There's nothing religious about what they're doing. They're criminals. One of you mentioned the word criminal. I think you mentioned criminal. That's the terminology we have to use. That's the terminology we're using in the mosque. We tell people, don't use the term jihad. Don't use the term Islamist. Don't use the term religious. They're not religious. They're criminal. No more than those of you who are Christian, would you call the Ku Klux Klan religious extremists? They were offensive for us. They wear a cross on their neck on the day, and at night they take that same cross, stick it on our lawn, and burn it with a fire. These are criminals. We're dealing with criminals, and that's really what Mike is saying. We're dealing with a criminal mind. And if any of us ever studied psychology, I didn't go in that direction in school, but I studied it while I was in college. We have to look at the psychic of these individuals. And the psychic of these individuals, they're justifying it. As long as they think they're connected to religion, they're going to continue to try and keep doing things. And that's the reason why you find all the terrorists are young people, never older people. The older ones are the ones who send the young ones out. They say, I'm not blowing myself up, but young man, you blow yourself up. And we may make this sound, laugh at that, make it sound like, but the bottom line is we have to watch our language. Something really basic. And someone may say, how can we do that? One of the things we can do, we're all truly working together, as I heard you say when I came in. If we're truly working together, law enforcement, Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, because they don't want to get blown up either. If all of us are working together, we need to create a new lexicon on the terminology that we use, and also involve the media. There are a number of people I've spoken to in the media that agree. Everybody's not going to agree with us. Some people are going to want to use those terms to sensitize things more, or to create more havoc and to have more drama to write about. But we have to start with basics. And when I heard you say that, that's what came to my mind, and that's what we already working on. Don't use, it's nothing, again, I'm going to say it again, no more religious extremists. These guys are criminals. A guy who wants to blow up kids, because that's what we have to do. We have to reach them before someone else gets it. And all the interfaith that we're doing, that's great. But sitting around singing Kumbaya is not going to solve our problem. We have to do some intra-faith. We have to re-educate those within our communities. And I'm talking about the Muslim community. I know now, Mike, you may not agree with me on this. And so a lot of Muslims have to agree with me. But I'm not here to be agreed with. The point being, some say, well, you're targeting the Muslim community, and I think you alluded to it too, Harris. That's where the problem is, right? There's no problem with Islam, but let's be candid. There is a problem with Muslims. We're not being, I'm saying this as a Muslim. There is a problem with it in our community, just like it was a problem for African Americans with the Ku Klux Klan who said they were Christians, just like it was a problem with the Nazis against the Jews. These are criminal-minded people. We have to watch our language. We need to work on a new lexicon to, and it's going to take time. It's not going to change overnight. We need to have a 2 to 5 year, 5 to 10 year plan. I'm a professional transportation planner by profession, but as a planner, we have to have a 2 to 5 year and a 5 to 10 year and a 10 to 20 year plan, starting with basic things that we can do together.
Well, I think on the lexicon issue, I mean, the whole term countering violent extremism was a 10-year effort to come to some way of dealing with that. And, talking and working in this issue, it's like walking across a lake that was once frozen, but it's March, and you don't know, where you might fall in. So I don't know any other paper where the first thing I did was a page and a half with a word on terminology to try to address those issues. And some of the terminology you mentioned is, never exited my lips. So, I think anybody that works in this area is very well aware of the sensitivities and the different words mean different things to different people. And, I don't disagree with really anything you said on that.
I think one interesting in the last debate, foreign policy debate, was this difference in terminology. And unfortunately, it has become a political issue to a certain extent. I think, at least, that this administration and this president, needs to be commended when it comes to terminology. The president has never, in the past 4 years, used the word Muslim extremist, Islamic extremist, jihadist. That just has not been part of his lexicon. And I think even his, generally, there's been a few times where they've slipped, but generally, even his cabinet level folks and national security folks have not used it. I think there was a couple of times when Secretary Napolitano used it, but it was complete. It was very quickly, revised. So I commend the president and this administration for that. But I also think it's become politicized to a certain extent. I mean, we saw Romney using Islamist, extremist, Muslim extremist, and because there is an effort to as you said earlier, to pander and to sound strong, and I think that's where we need to focus on to make sure that, just as now we've been able to get one side of the aisle to stop using that term to a large extent, we need to push back and say, this is not healthy for anyone to use, because you're right, it gives them religious legitimacy, and that's the last thing that we want.
Could I just supplement that? I think President Bush was actually quite strong on this issue as well, and you could find a couple of examples where phrases were uttered that were then not used again, but I did a little miniature study looking for those kinds of Islamic terrorism and things during his administration, and you could find one or two examples, but his rhetoric was very strong, and he did some things that the current president has not done, like the very visible mosque visit at the early part of his administration, and other starting the tradition of iftar dinners in the White House and other things. So President Bush was good on that. The problem is a lot of people in his party did not follow his lead.
So I want to say two things about that, one of which is very non-idealistic and one of which is very idealistic. And it does, to make good policy, we have to have better politics. And it comes back around to, there used to be a really interesting Muslim element of the Republican Party. And in some states, that was very strong. And there are totally understandable reasons why that's not the case anymore. But we will have better policy when we change that. And the more that the American Muslim agenda, to the extent that there is such a thing, is perceived as a subset of the Democratic Party, that's not good for anybody. Both because it hurts the issues with Republicans, and it hurts Democrats' ability to do good things and not be accused of just pandering. So you really, many people want to fix this from a policy side, don't want to mess around in politics, feel like it's yucky, but that's where. And this leads to the idealistic thing I want to say, which is that although every situation is unique, we've never lived through an era like this one, the challenges the American Muslim community faces are really unique, but this is a really American story, and you referenced this if you think about some of the things the African American community went through, not just with the KKK, but in the 60s, where you had every strand of African American activism imaginable, peaceful, not peaceful. The Irish American community and the IRA and all the bars around this country that still are plastered with, by the way, terrorist propaganda. Yet we lived through that as a society, and nobody talks about it or cares about it anymore. So, and Catholicism is understood, and the Irish are assimilated at this point. So we do have, although it's not the same, and you should never say it's the same, but this is a profoundly American story, and in that way, it's a profoundly optimistic story.
Should we end with an optimistic note? Save you all the last 5 minutes and go out feeling good. So I want to thank you all for this really interesting conversation. Maybe I'll just try and stay positive, but summarize a few key points that stuck out for me. I think clearly the whole idea of anecdotes and broad sweeping language and getting beyond sort of the negative parts of that, and as our guest talks about getting to the positive stories and where we can build bipartisan support for that. And just thinking about the next administration, the perception of the nature of the threat, and how different administrations may deal with that, but also how delicate that balance is. So literally any incident, both within the U.S. or internationally, could impact that, I think, is another key thing to think about. And then the language and the politics. So I think Heather's point was great. Better politics will lead to better policy, and I think all of us are probably hopeful that that can happen sooner rather than later. Maybe not in the next 2 weeks, but soon after that. So hopefully that summarizes a few key things, and I'm sure if there's a few more questions, we can catch those at the end. But I want to thank Duke again for hosting us, and to the panelists for joining us, and thank all of you for your participation. We have
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.